Matthew chapter 9. Today, we're having a short talk about the new wine of the kingdom. If you're taking notes, that's the only point you're going to get today, all right? So we're just titling this talk, The New Wine of the Kingdom, because, Jesus has come and he has introduced this idea of his kingdom here on earth, and people are scratching their heads and they don't know what to do with it, right? And so we went through the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus was giving the ethics of this new kingdom, and it was just turning upside down everything that people thought that they knew about the world and about religion. And he has just a way of showing up and changing things, right? He has just a way of showing up and shifting your thinking on things, especially in times of great change. And so I would say that as you read through the Gospel of Matthew on your own, hopefully multiple times as we're walking through that you'll notice that there is a couple of different levels that are happening where Jesus is ministering and healing somebody at a very human level, and yet in the scope of history, there's greater things that are happening, and Jesus often uses those opportunities to wake us up and to shake us up and to help us to drop traditions that we never would have dropped otherwise. There's many things that have probably happened in your own life, right? Where you came away from a situation improved in your walk with the Lord, but in a way that you would have never chosen to have that happen. And many times God has to tear or pull those things out of our hands or out of our lives in order for us to be able to receive them. And only after maybe a few weeks or months after we look back and go, hey, during the moment I was throwing a tantrum like a little child because I did not want to lose out on what I felt like God was taking away from me in that moment. And yet now when I look back, I wouldn't change it for the world. And so throughout history, we see a lot of these wineskin bursting moments where God is doing something, where things are changing politically or otherwise, and there's an upheaval that's happening in society or culture, and God uses those opportunities to bring his people back to his presence and to a closer walk with him. No time like the moment that we're looking at here now, the ministry of Jesus Christ, where things were changing so much because there was a changing of the guard, so to speak, where the Old Testament time period was coming to an end, and there was this gift of Jesus Christ and this fulfillment of the Old Testament, and then the beginning of the church. And so everything that people thought they knew about organized religion, that seemed to be going through this metamorphosis. And it's just hard to have handles on things during those times, right? How many of you guys here like certainty in your life? You like things to travel along at a set pace. And if it didn't change, if your schedule didn't change from now till the time you go home to meet Jesus, you'd be okay with that. Yeah, I think there's several of us like that, right? And then there's others who are like, hey, I like the adventure. Give me change. Just bring it on. I'll just go with the flow. And depending on how you're wired, depends a lot on how you'll react to that in that moment. And what's happening here in this moment is that Jesus is showing up, and people are having a hard time processing the things that he's saying, but also the things that he's telling them that are foreshadowing what's about to come. And so there's really no context. They really don't have a category for what's happening in the moment and what's going to be happening, because the things that they were expecting, the Messiah that was to come, the political Messiah that they were hoping for that would rescue them from their current political situation, Jesus is saying, I'm not that guy. I've never was that guy. That guy never existed except in your mind, because I've always been your king, and I always will be. And so even though things in your life are going to be up and down, no matter how much you want them to stay the same, no matter how much you want to hold on to that certainty, that's going to change. And so what happens over time is that people who are in a true heart are following God, they, unknowing to themselves a lot of times, begin to turn some of those good things into long-time traditions. And then they feel like they become the right spiritual thing to do when it might have just been for that moment that they were in. And sometimes as C.S. Lewis says, sometimes a person like that he says, a certain kind of bad man can take a tradition like that or a conviction like that and impose it on other people because they might feel that what God has called them to do personally, they now have the right to impose that conviction or moral onto somebody else when it's not really a truth that we see in Scripture. You still with me? Great. Let's read the passage. We're going to start Matthew 9:14. Then the disciples of John came to Jesus, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made." Another example, verse 17. "Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." And so Jesus does this beautiful thing that he does where he over answers a question, right? Where he says, "Thank you for your introduction question. Now I'll take it somewhere that you didn't realize your mind needed to go." And so we won't get into all of that today. In fact, today we're just going to be looking at verses 14 and 15. And in the next 2 Sundays, we'll be finishing up and talking about those other verses. So then the disciples of John, that's John the Baptist. So John the Baptist had come on the scene. You know, he was the forerunner of Jesus Christ. He was paving the way and letting folks know that the Messiah was coming, and we've read about that and studied that. And they came to him with a question, and this is not the first time, even in this chapter, that people are having an issue with what Jesus is doing and saying, right? So if you look back in verse 3 of this chapter, you'll see the scribes, right? They were upset with Jesus. Why? Because Jesus, come on, Jesus, you just said you forgave this man's sin, right? This paralyzed man, you're forgiving his sins? What? I mean, you'd have to be God to do that. So the scribes had a problem with Jesus. But then if you go to verse 11, you see that the Pharisees had a problem with Jesus, right? And so Jesus calls Matthew from his lifestyle that he was living into discipleship, into following Jesus. And then he goes to his house and has a killer party, right? And the Pharisees, they were not cool with that. And they're like, why is your master hanging out with tax collectors and sinners? And so Jesus, has a beautiful response to that about the reason why he came, to call the people who were hurting and broken, and not to those who didn't feel like they needed a doctor, people that recognized their need for healing. And so then we see a third group, and these are the disciples of John the Baptist, the followers of John, and they come to Jesus and they have a question. We don't really know the intention of their heart in this question, right? But it was a practice of the Pharisees in this day and time to fast 2 times a week. And so they would fast on like Monday and Thursday. And then it seems that John's disciples picked up this same practice because it seemed like a pretty good practice, right? Although it is extracurricular practice in the sense that in the Old Testament, that was never called for. The only fast that we see called for in the Old Testament is the fast on the Day of Atonement. That doesn't mean that fasting additional to that is off bounds. Of course it's not. But to make it a practice and then to impose it on everybody else and insist that they do what you're doing, Jesus pushes back on that. Then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast? Look how good we are." I mean, that's the kind of way I read that is just like, hey, not cool. Like, in fact, this may have been one of their special days of fasting. And think about it. Where does it appear, if this is in chronological order right here, where does it appear that Jesus is at? seems like maybe he's wrapping up things at Matthew's house, right? Or at least that's the way that Matthew shares it with us at this point, is that he's at Matthew's house, he's having a good time, he's eating and drinking. Jesus is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard in the scriptures because he spends so much time hanging out with people who like to party things up. And that just is not in line with the self-righteousness of the Pharisees. So then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" So keep in mind that fasting in the Old Testament was seen, or in Old Testament times, was seen largely as a time of mourning. It was a time of fasting and sackcloth, right? People would put on old clothing and they would then tear that clothing, and then they would disfigure themselves and put ashes on their head and on their face, because it was a time of mourning where maybe they had felt that God's hand had been removed from the people, and they were sad about that, and they were wanting God to intervene and change and do something. And so they were asking Jesus, how come your disciples are not fasting and giving these things up and mourning? Because it would appear that they're wanting these changes to happen. They're wanting this political Messiah to show up and come at this specific time, and they're hoping that Jesus is it, but it doesn't appear that he's acting the way that the guy they're waiting for would act. In New Testament times, fasting has a little bit of a different flavor to it, because now we're looking back on this new wine of Jesus Christ, right? We've tasted and seen that the Lord is good, and we've experienced the gospel, and we've experienced the grace of his salvation in our lives, and we can look back and see what has happened. And so in one sense, we do look back and we thank God for who he is and what he has done in our lives. And yet there's still a future aspect toward our fasting as well, where we're seeking God's presence and we're seeking his hand and his guidance, and we're also looking forward to his second coming, to his return. And so there's a little bit of a different flavor in our New Testament fasting than in an Old Testament fasting. But they want to know why. And you maybe have wrestled with this in your own life. If God's given you a special conviction in your life about what kind of movies you will or won't watch, or maybe what about where you go with your time, or maybe you do have a practice of fasting, which I recommend, which is a really good thing to have as a practice in your life, that you would give that time to the Lord. It's a great time for us to be able just to experience this time or this moment in our lives where we are sacrificing and letting go of the things that seem to get a grip on us and giving ourselves back to the Lord. But we've maybe wrestled with this same question of like, well, why? Well, how come if God's calling me to do this, that he's not calling other people to do this? Or if God's calling our church to go on this journey, how come other churches are not doing the same thing? And God's got his own plan and his own reasons for individuals and for groups of people that are following him. So how does Jesus respond? And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn?" And see, there's the mourning part, right? So Jesus is looking at this question that he's received and saying, hey, you're seeing fasting as a time of mourning, as a time of grieving, and you want me to join you in that on Mondays and Thursdays, but I've got some parties on my schedule on those days. It's not really working out for me, right? Jesus says, can the wedding guests mourn? Can they cry? Can they be in distress as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. So what is Jesus' response to this question about fasting, or this question really about how they're living their lives and why they're not following the norm and doing what other religious people of their day are doing? And how come Jesus is operating in a different way and doesn't seem to be in step with scribes, Pharisees, and even the followers of John the Baptist? And Jesus' response to them kind of helps answer on a lower level a question, But he's also helping us to see at a greater level that there's something bigger going on here than they could see in this moment. And so he foreshadows that with this picture that he gives them. Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? And so in the original language there, when we're talking about wedding guests, they would be talking about the specific people that are closest to the groom during this wedding. And the wedding then wouldn't have just been a 30-minute wedding, right, which a lot of us maybe experienced when we got married. How long was your wedding, Jason and Bree? No pressure here. You didn't time it, of course.
It was such a blissful.
It was just, it seemed like eternity. Yeah.
And yet 1 minute.
Yeah. Wow. Not long enough and too long. So, okay. Well, wedding celebrations in this culture would have lasted for days, right? Family would have traveled in. They couldn't just fly in. They would have taken a long time to travel there. And then they would stay for a long time, and they would celebrate leading up to the wedding day because marriage is such a big deal. And so they would come and they would recognize this was happening. And Jesus is just saying that this is a time of joy and celebration at this human level, at this marriage level between a couple. We see Jesus at the wedding at Cana, where he turns water into wine. It's a celebration, and he's keeping the party going. After a few days of partying, they had run out of wine, and they were like, well, what are we going to do? This is embarrassing. And Jesus, fortunately, turns water into wine for them. All that to say, it's a several 2, 3, 4, 5 day long celebration depending on the kind of money that you might have. And so Jesus is saying that the people that are closest to the bridegroom, the dude, that they should not be mourning and shouldn't be a downer during that time, right? You wouldn't want a guy showing up at your wedding. I'm going to keep picking on you guys since you were talking about your 10 years. I mean, how bad would it be to have your best man or the maid of honor at your wedding as you're getting ready, just like feeding you negativity, right? Like, I don't know. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? Yet I'm married. I'm telling you, do not do this. It's hard work. It is hard, right? But totally rewarding and worth it. And so Jesus is saying, of course not. That's not the time. This is a great time of celebration because love is in the air. There's a bridegroom. There's a bride. A new thing is happening. What's a new thing happening? A new thing happening is that a new family is being created. It's a beautiful design by God that a man and a woman would come together and that they would be joined together in holy matrimony. And in that moment, God as their witness, this new covenant is being ratified, and this brand new family is happening. Now, regardless, if in our culture people don't value the family the way that they should or the way that they did in this time, it still is a miracle from God that two people could be joined together and create this whole new branch on a family tree. And so that's what's happening, and that should always be a time of joy and celebrating. So why would I fast during that time? Why? I wouldn't want my best man to show up in sackcloth and ashes, right? Like, whoa, what are you trying to say? Is this a sign that this is not going to go well? Man, cheer up. I need to replace you with somebody who's going to pump me up. I need a pump-up man during this time. And so that's what's happening. That's how he answers them. And they see this human illustration, and he's wanting them to see that something's happening that they don't understand. What is it? Jesus is identifying himself as the bridegroom that's prophesied about in the Old Testament and saying, I am that bridegroom that's the prophets talked about in the Old Testament, and I am here, and now is my moment, and I am meeting with my bride, and this new family called the church is about to be started, and it is a beautiful and a wonderful thing. And while I am here and while I am present, it would be a shame that during this new wine moment that I would call my disciples to fast and to mourn and to give up. Instead, what they should do is they should enjoy every ounce of my presence while I am here with them. And then he goes on to say that when I'm gone, then they will fast. Jesus is not saying that his disciples shouldn't fast or that they'll never fast. Instead, what he's saying is that now recognizing the importance of this moment, that they should not. And so what was just happening there is just that the Pharisees and John's disciples both were at a loss. They were a little bit blind to see the bigger picture of what was happening in the scope of history. And it always is, right? In the moment of history, you always have to kind of look back at history and go, oh, that's what was happening during that moment in time. In the moment, you're probably going through a lot of turmoil and changes, and you're experiencing it not as, hey, this is a wonderful moment or a huge moment or momentous occasion, but as all that certainty that you like's being disrupted. But it's a great opportunity for God to do a new wine thing in your heart and in your life. Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn or be sad as long as the bridegroom is with them?" The days, rhetorical question, the answer should be no. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. Jesus, this is the first hint that we receive in Matthew about what will happen to Jesus. The day will come when the bridegroom, that's me, Jesus is saying, when the bridegroom not leaves, but is taken away from them. So this is a hint for us to know that something is happening to this king, that he's going to be taken away into captivity, that he's going to be arrested. And we know as we look back on this story, and we can read through to the end and see that this taken away that he's referring here to is when he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And when he is willingly laying down his life on a cross, and when he's nailed to that cross by Roman soldiers, and when onlookers cheer on and celebrate that this Messiah king is being, in their minds, taken off the scene. That's what he's referring to here, is that the bridegroom's going to be taken away from them. Let me pause right there and just say, thank the Lord Jesus Christ for that gift. That's the real thing we celebrate, right? That Jesus gave his life, died, rose again from the grave 3 days later, and now lives eternally with the Father, and is coming back one day for me and you. That's the real deal. But the days are coming when they're going to face uncertainty, and they're going to be sad, and they're going to be just in a lot of turmoil and upheaval and asking questions and wondering why things just couldn't stay steady the way that they were, what was wrong. Even I believe, in a moment like where the Pharisees and scribes were in this moment in history, you know how you can get used to a bad situation? Of course, the nation of Israel had come into the promised land thousands of years earlier, and they had been able to live there for a time. Yes, there was a lot of ups and downs, but live there for a time with the favor of God upon them. And now here in this moment, they are under the rule of the Roman Empire. But even in that kind of a situation, don't you just sometimes kind of build a certainty in that, and you hold fast to it, and you're like, okay, it's not the best situation, but at least I know what's going to happen from day to day. And even that was about to be taken away, because not too long after the writing of this book, the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. And so they wouldn't even be able to go back and operate in their religious system the way that they were used to. And I believe God, intentionally did that, of course, so that they wouldn't even try to do that. And sometimes that's just what God has to do for us, is he has to take away things so that we won't try to go back to old ways of doing things and old ways of being people. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. All you got to do is go to the book of Acts, and you see Jesus ascends into heaven, and the fasting starts. Explicitly, we're not told that they fasted in those 10 days that they went back to Jerusalem and waited. But there are many other occasions in the book of Acts where you see God's people fasting and praying and seeking God. And that's what's happening right after the bridegroom is taken away, is that they do begin to fast. They do begin to seek his presence. His physical presence was no longer with them, so they were seeking his spiritual presence in their fasting. And that's what we as a church want to be about for this week of our 21 days of prayer. That we would be about seeking the presence of God, that we would be about praying and fasting and asking God to reveal himself to us in a new and a fresh way, and to help us see, to open up our eyes, to help us to see what's happening in the greater picture of things. That we wouldn't just be caught up on, well, wait, my schedule changed. Well, hey, we're not in the same building anymore, or we're meeting at a different time. Like, that's not the biggest thing, right? The bigger thing is like what God is doing in our city and in our country and in our personal lives, and not just that our schedules get changed or mixed up a little bit, but saying, Lord, what are you doing that I'm not in control of, that I can get on board with you and realize that no matter what happens, the most important thing for me is that I'm abiding in you, that I'm spending time with you, that I'm being changed by you in the process. And maybe you're using all of that to do that in me, because in any other way, I would just make my own little self-moral modifications that are convenient for me. You ever done that? Where you're like, hey, I want to get closer to the Lord. I'll tweak something here, and maybe I'll get a tiny, and God's like, no, I love you too much to leave you there. I'm going to change some things drastically so that you have to come to me and ask why and depend on me. And maybe that even means that that'll be a time of pain and mourning for you. But on the other side, you'll remember God is good. And that giving up things that we held on to are okay when what we get in return is more time with Jesus.